Have you been wanting to migrate to Azure SQL Managed Instance but felt blocked because you use Windows Auth today in your organization? In this episode, learn how you can use Windows Auth in Azure SQL Managed Instance, how it works, how to get it set up, and even a cool demo. This week on Data Exposed. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed. Today, we're going to be talking about an exciting topic that I think y'all will be really interested in, especially if you're migrating to Azure SQL. And for that, I'm bringing on Sravani. So, Sravani, thanks so much for joining us again on Data Exposed. We're so happy to have you back. Today, you're going to be telling us about Windows Auth for Azure SQL Managed Instance and how you might go about setting that up. I'm really excited to learn more about this. So I thought we could start with just kind of like, what is it and why are customers kind of asking for something like this?
Sure, Anna. Thanks. Thank you for having me back. Let's quickly talk about Windows authentication for SQL managed instance. We just went GA a couple of weeks ago. Uh, we have customers who started modernizing their applications, data tiers. Along with that, they also started modernizing their identity management by shifting their Active Directories to the Azure AD, right? So Azure AD authentication already works for Azure SQL and managed instance today, and with SQL 2022, we started supporting Azure AD authentication, and we have different ways of authenticating Azure AD users, like with password or universal with MFA or integrated authentication. However, we still have customers who cannot migrate to Azure AD users, or they cannot start using Azure AD authentication because of certain dependencies. So what we are trying to solve with this feature is basically customers who has native Windows authentication mechanism to access their applications and the SQL instances in a secure way, and customers who cannot use the Azure AD authentication due to some kind of dependencies on their legacy drivers, or some application dependencies, or they cannot recompile their libraries, things like that, right? So though we have Azure SQL with integrated authentication, like I said, there are some limitations, like they cannot set up the Azure AD federation workflows, or they might have to recompile with modern libraries, or simply their applications are not compatible. So with the existing Azure AD authentication options, we started supporting Windows authentication, which is the native authentication, which SQL customers are aware for several years. And this Windows authentication helps you to work with legacy drivers, which does not have a built-in support for Azure AD, and it also works for both domain joined machines, client machines, Azure AD joined client machines, and it also works in your double hop scenarios, like where you have your applications running in IaaS with an impersonation, right? Run as a service or something, right? So the Windows authentication supports all these scenarios. And customer has to how you set it up is very simple. They don't have to make any changes at the application level, which is the great thing to call out. And all they have to do is an initial infrastructure setup, which is something like setting up some Kerberos tokens in their client machines, and then setting up something in the SQL managed instance from the Azure portal. So then the initial infrastructure setup is a one-time activity, and it's pretty simple, and the documentation is very clear with the steps. The first step is obviously to synchronize their Active Directory users with the Azure Active Directory. I think this is something most of our customers already have as they are modernizing their identity, right? Then we have this there are two flows that works for this Windows authentication. One is the traditional incoming trust flow, and the second model is the modern interactive flow. So based on the client machine from which you are trying to connect to the SQL managed instance, you have to establish one of these flows for your Windows authentication to work. So for example, for traditional incoming trust, this is something that our customers known for several years. It works through the Kerberos authentication model, and customers have to set up the Kerberos proxy for the Azure Active Directory. they we already have a PowerShell module which is provided. All they have to do is download the PowerShell module, provide the parameters, and create that the Kerberos tokens with the Azure Active Directory. And this works for the Active Directory joined machines, and it has to be Windows Server 2012 and above. So for the modern interactive flow, it's if your client is a Azure AD joined or a hybrid joined or a AD joined machine, and if the operating system is Windows 10, 21, H1 and above, in that case they don't have to do anything. We just have to enable a local policy to allow Kerberos token during the login. And once the local policy is configured, the modern interactive flow works just fine. So only clause for this is the applications that can have an interactive flow where they get where you can provide the login. That is where you can set up this flow. So customer has both options to configure, and then once the client machine is configured with the required Kerberos tokens and the local policies, they should be able to connect to the SQL managed instance using Windows authentication. And from the SQL MI part, all they have to do is you have to create the service principals, which is again our customers are aware, right? The service principal names, and you also have to provide the admin consent for the managed instance in your Azure Active Directory. So this is how the workflow works. So your client machine will be falling in one of these two buckets. It will be either Windows 22 or Windows 10, and then it is either Active Directory joined, hybrid joined, or it's just a Azure AD joined machine. Based on the client machine, you just have to set up one of these two items, either to establish incoming trust flow or to establish modern interactive flow.
Nice. That's definitely going to be a helpful chart for folks.
Yes, absolutely. And how it works is basically once the client sends the request to the Active Directory, first it obviously searches within Active Directory and finds that this is not a valid account, and then it checks for that suffix and see whether it is coming from any trusted objects like from the Kerberos TLN list. And if once it validates that, the request is sent to the Azure AD Kerberos to get the TCT. And once we have the ticket granting ticket, that is how we exchange it with the managed instance, and then the connection is established. So we are achieving this with the Azure Active Directory Kerberos authentication support. And today, I think the Kerberos from Azure AD supports a couple of applications. One is the managed instance, and the other one is the Azure File Store. So we were able to collaborate with the team and able to achieve this, and it just works fine. So if you see, I just have a pictorial view of this, how it works. So you have the client, you have managed instance, and you have Azure Active Directory. And once the request is sent, it is the Kerberos ticket is encrypted Kerberos ticket is sent to the managed instance, and it is exchanged with the Azure AD, and we get a Azure AD token, and the user is authenticated at the managed instance level. So
Wow.
with this, customers can start migrating their applications to the Azure AD users. This is to boost the Azure AD authentication further and help our customers to use Azure AD users. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so it seems like there's a couple steps, but at the end of the day, Windows Auth is really going to help folks, especially as they're migrating, as they're going through this modernization process, before they can just, go to full Azure AD only. So really cool stuff. Thanks for sharing it with us. It's exciting that it's in general availability now. I'd love if you have something just to take a look at kind of how this works or how it looks.
Absolutely. Let me quickly share my screen. So before I take you to my client machine, this is my SQL managed instance that I have in my portal. So from SQL managed instance, all I have to do is to configure service principals. We have to one moment. You have to go to this identity tab where you have to assign this system assigned service principal. So by default it is off. Once you configure this to on, the service principals will be created for your managed instance, which can be used to authenticate using Kerberos protocol, right? So the service principals is something that SQL customers love. We have been hearing this for several years. That is how the Windows authentication works across domains. So once you do that from the portal, then let me take you to my client machine. So this is my client machine. This is just to verify what kind of client I'm running in. If you see, I have a client machine that has joined a domain AAD SQL MI. And if you see, this is a Azure AD joined client. So it is S. So from this machine, I'm just connecting to my management studio database engine. And if you see, this is my managed instance, and you can see that I'm using Windows authentication, and I'm able to connect, right? So yeah, so I just connected with the Windows authentication. And not only this, you can also now launch the tools that you have been using for uh, like several years with SQL, like SQL Profiler, extended events, which actually dependent on the Windows authentication. And now they pretty much just works fine with the managed instance as well. So you can use this for all troubleshooting purpose using Windows authentication. So you can, all these client tools which are dependent on the Windows authentication just works fine. And if you see, I also have my um, DC where I can show you the Kerberos trust where it is established. So if you see, this is my domain. Uh, I'm trying to. So this is the partial module that that you have to use. So here I'm trying to get the Kerberos server details for this AAD SQL MI.NET domain with for a specific principal name. And if you see, the cloud trust display. So there is a trusted object that is created with the Azure AD KDC service. And for this is the cloud domain name, that is aad_sqlmi.net. So you have to do is create this Kerberos token. And once this is created, you should be able to connect from your client machine to the managed instance.
Cool, awesome. Thanks so much, Ravani, for showing us Windows Auth for Azure SQL Managed Instance, and even taking us one step deeper to say, hey, this is how you actually configure it. This is what it looks like. This is the PowerShell module that we've created to kind of make it that much easier for you to get set up and configured. I just want to thank you a ton for coming on the show. To our viewers, we'll put some links in the description so you can get started, get hands-on, learn more, set this up in your organization. And if you like this episode, go ahead, give it a like, leave us a comment, and let us know what you think about Windows Auth for Azure SQL Managed Instance. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.